Welcome to online class with Mr. Regas, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about residential schools. Now, I know most of you have probably learned about residential schools before in the past, and we've talked about them in our class already. You can't talk about this enough, though. Myself, I'm learning more about residential schools every year. When I was in grade school, I never learned about these. I cannot believe that. And so I cannot say how important it is, or I can't say enough about how important it is that we actually talk about these issues. So many people grow up with this idea that Canada has been this, place where nothing bad happens, no discrimination happens. That's not true. But we need to be able to talk about it in order to understand where we are in the present and then learn how to heal from these things. So some of this might be review for you, but some of it will be new as well. This is an image I bet lots of you have seen before. If you haven't, what we're seeing here is a young boy. His name was Thomas More. The image on the left, here he is in traditional wear. It's the same boy on the image on the right, yet there's obvious changes that have occurred. If I were to ask you what the explicit imagery here is, or the explicit information, you could discuss things like the clothing he is wearing, the changes in his clothing, stature, hair, where the pictures were taken. The implicit message, well, what's going on? Why is his clothing changing from a traditional indigenous outfit to what we would call a Western? Well, as some of you already know, we're looking at the process of assimilation here. One thing I want to make clear, these residential schools and this process of assimilation that was occurring, this is in Canada. This is not in Europe. Therefore, it is Canadians who are doing this. Oftentimes people will say the Europeans or becoming like Europeans. That's not the case. Yes, Canada was heavily influenced by Europe, especially Britain, but we are a sovereign country. These things are taking place in Canada. Therefore, they're trying to transform people into a Canadian image. You could also call this Western or based upon European influence, but I cannot stress enough that you need to be able to distinguish that this is Canada. The United States had similar schools. We're not going to talk about those, though. Not today, at least. Here's a map showing where residential schools in Canada were. So if you just take a look at it for a couple moments, you'll see that they're spread out throughout the country, but they're really centered, the most are in the western provinces. Alberta actually had the most residential schools. So who went to these schools? Every Aboriginal child between the ages of 5 to 15 years old. Over the decades, thousands of children across Canada, so First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, they all passed through these schools. Now, obviously, you can't say 100% of First Nation students or First Nations children went to these schools, but it was a large percentage. And if you did not go to schools that you were supposed to, well, parents would face some pretty harsh punishments. So what did the children do here? The purpose of residential schools was to learn useful skills such as farming, carpentry, and domestic skills. Now you'll notice useful is in parentheses or in apostrophes. This is because usefulness was viewed differently from a Canadian or Eurocentric viewpoint than a traditional Indigenous standpoint. If we think back to, let's say, the history of Canada, the first wave of immigration into North America happened around the year 14,000 BCE, so approximately 16,000 years ago. They figured at that point they were able to walk across the Bering Strait because it was frozen. They call it an ice bridge. They came down and they settled in North America. 16,000 years passes though. Did the people survive? Yes. Did they thrive? Yes. We have all sorts of evidence of great civilizations that were present in North America over the past 10,000 years. There were extremely complex societies with cities, organized government, trade. What I'm trying to say here is that they knew how to live in North America. So why do they need to be taught new skills, right? Would their skills not be deemed useful? When Europeans started settling and colonizing North America, how did they survive? It was with the help of First Nations groups in Canada and the United States. Yet when we fast forward to the past about 150 years, well, society becomes shaped around a new way of living. And so, in order to survive and thrive in this new society, you need to have those Western skills. Farming. It's like saying, no, your traditional way of gathering food or growing food, that's not going to cut it anymore. You have to live on this small plot of land and farm. You also have to learn domestic skills. So things were very gender-based as well. And you can see that in these photos. Males, you were learning things like carpentry. Females, well, you better learn how to cook and sew. So the purpose here is to teach them these white British Canadian skills instead of hunting, gathering, or other traditional ways of life that allowed these people to thrive for thousands of years. So the government created what's called the Department of Indian Affairs. This gave responsibility for the schools to the Anglican and Catholic Church in Canada. The aim here is to civilize, assimilate, and educate the Aboriginal children into the British way of life. Again, civilize, that's from a matter of opinion. It's subjective. Your idea of civilized might be different than another person's idea of civilized. This was present in things like imperialism in places like the Congo as well. That's why we see that poem, The White Man's Burden, being written. The use of terms like the noble savage. Europeans saw it as their responsibility to go and turn the rest of the world into people like them, because that was civilized. The government of Canada in 1876 created something called the Indian Act. This piece of legislation has great power and casts responsibility among many different aspects of life. We'll talk about that later. It's still called the Indian Act. That language never changed. And so we see like the Department of Indian Affairs. Well, the education of First Nations fell upon the federal government. These are two photos taken from the Royal Alberta Museum, which is in Edmonton. These are what's called admissions ledgers. So to St. Mary's Residential School, Cardston, Alberta. The dates for these, 1898 to 1905. Now it's a little difficult to read, but what you'll see on the left, we have two columns, Indian name and white name. When you went to a residential school, the first thing that happened was your name was removed from you. Now, some of you may not think much about your name. I don't know. Maybe some of you don't even like your name. But the fact is that is an extremely important part of your individual identity. Parents in any culture around the world put a great deal of thought and care into the naming of their children, because this is something that will be identified with. So to take away somebody's name is that first step of just stripping that identity from you. You'll see some of the names in the white name category: Harry Big Throat, Sam Snake Eater. You can try to read the rest of those. The pictures aren't the clearest, but again, it's showing that stripping of identity. Now, the image on the right, what we'll see over here, we have names. We also have this category here. This is death. And as you'll notice, it is not an empty category. Many students died in residential schools due to things like abuse, neglect, being subjected to experiments. These things are not acceptable. Obviously, today, you could not operate a school with this happening. Yet it didn't raise any eyes then. Here's a poem by Rita Joe. She's a Micmac poet. This is about her experience attending the residential school in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. Now, I want you to read this on your own, but what you're seeing here is about that culture being taken away, being made to think like another person, but then trying to regain some of that back later in life. Extremely powerful. Here's some quotes. Now, I'll let you read these on your own, but what they're looking at here is this idea that generation after generation was taken from a traditional family, those roles of mother and father, they were taken away. And instead of growing up in a caring environment, you're growing up in an environment where you're not loved and you're told you're not meaningful either. This is so important and impactful because you end up having this legacy of like intergenerational trauma being passed down. Here's another quote showing the process of transformation and the way this individual viewed their own culture, going from being mortified at imagery and television, the way First Nations were depicted, to eventually agreeing with those because of what they're being taught in school. Some of the examples of punishment that happened at these schools: if you failed a test, maybe you didn't eat for a day. You didn't work hard enough? Well, you'll get 4 hours of extra work. Maybe you were disobedient, rude, or had disorderly conduct. Well, no food or water for a day, get beat, and extra garden work. For speaking native language, and again, remember that you might have been taken from your home, placed in a school with no knowledge of English or French. So obviously, you're only going to be speaking your language. First time you do this, though, no supper. Second time, no supper, and you got beat. Third offense, this is considered disobedience, and so you're punished as such. Maybe you went off by yourself. So maybe you'll be punished by having several hours of kneeling alone on a rock floor where all can see. These are just some of the punishments that were given. But again, any expression of your culture resulted in punishment. These aren't the only problems. Excessive physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in the schools. So in 1969, the government took control away from the church. So now these are controlled by the federal government. I'll let you watch this video on your own. But again, that process of a culture being taken away, but then wanting to find out about it again because it's a beautiful thing. Here's a painting by Alex Janvier, Canadian, Some of you may have seen his work at the new Rogers Place Arena in Edmonton. This is his depiction of residential schools. You can read on the back, he expresses what he lost while he was there. So how do you right the wrongs that were done in the past? You can't erase the past, but at some point we need to be able to address it. So the Government of Canada delivered a statement of reconciliation to all Aboriginal peoples and included an apology to those who had experienced sexual and physical abuse while attending a residential school. In particular, it mentioned that the Canadian government regretted the treatment of Aboriginal people. One thing that's important here is to understand what that word reconciliation means, to reconcile. This involves things like forgiveness. But to forgive, you also have to have somebody admitting what happened. In 1999, the government sponsored discussions across Canada, giving an opportunity to develop solutions to the issues that residential schools formed. This was the first time the three parties were able to sit together and constructively discuss these issues. It's estimated there's about 86,000 people alive today who attended Indian residential schools. That is a huge number. These are not things that happened far back in the past that have no relevance today. This is real. What happened there is still felt by tens of thousands of people in this country. So what we see over the past couple decades is some developments. November 2005, the government offered $2 billion in payments to victims of residential schools. Under something called the Kelowna Accord, each survivor would have been eligible for a $10,000 lump sum payment, plus $3,000 for each year spent in schools. There was another $125 million offered to fund a healing program to help deal with psychological issues. The plan was supposed to erase all lawsuits against the government. But the Kelowna Accord was ignored for 2 years. Later in 2007, a compensation package was announced. So the federal government approved agreement will provide nearly $2 billion to the former students who had attended 130 schools. June 2015, the Alberta NDP government apologized for residential schools. Other leaders, both federal and provincial, have offered apologies. And again, you might not think that an apology accomplishes much, but it at least is a way of opening up conversation. As long as somebody says, no, I didn't do this, I'm not sorry, you can't move forward. And so what was created in the last 10 years was something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What they did is they came back with 94 recommendations for reconciliation. These are some of the things that were included here in the 94 recommendations. Things like an apology for the role played by the Roman Catholic Church. So they want an apology from the Pope. An increase to CBC and Radio Canada funding to better ensure it can support reconciliation and include the languages and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples. Mandatory age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and the contributions of Aboriginal peoples taught across Canada from kindergarten to grade 12. These are just a few of the 94 recommendations. One of the recommendations to get an apology from the Pope has refused to give. He was in Canada a couple years ago, and when presented with the opportunity to fulfill one of these 94 recommendations, he refused. Why? I'm not sure. What we're seeing is a lack of accepting of guilt. Now, this is just a brief discussion about residential schools. This is not thorough, but it should give you a little bit of an idea of what happened, why, and then what's been happening more present.